Hello everyone, it's Professor Muldrow once again. In this video, I'm going to show you how Java does two-dimensional arrays. Here's an example of a declaration of a two-dimensional array. I've called the array vals, and it has 4 rows and 4 columns. As you can see on this PowerPoint slide, this is one way to declare a two-dimensional array. In the example on the slide, the array has 3 rows and 5 columns. And so in memory, it looks something like this. Notice, however, that you need 2 sets of indexes to access an individual element of this array. And indexes still start at 0. So we have row index 0, row index 1, row index 2, and then column index 0, column index 1, all the way to column index 4. The rules for indexes in a two-dimensional array are the same as for a one-dimensional array. Array indexes always start with 0, always. So if you wanted to access individual elements, like for example, here we have grid bracket 0 and bracket 3 is going to get a value of 8. And that means you go to row index 0, column index 3, and that's where your 8 goes. Similarly, for this next line, you go to row index 2, column index 0, and that's where the 4 ends up. Now, what I've done in the code is I'm calling these 2 methods, init and display. Here they are. Since we have 2 sets of indexes, we're going to use nested for loops to initialize and to display the elements. But I want you to notice something. When you use nested for loops to go through a two-dimensional array, very typically the outside for loop, in this case the x loop, is going to be associated with the rows. So we're going to say x equals 0, x less than the array's length. So as it says here in this slide, length is the number of rows. But look what I've done for the second loop, the inside loop, aka the y loop. I have y less than a bracket x dot length. Here is a feature that's unique to Java. So if I just say name of array dot length for a two-dimensional array, that's the number of rows. If I say name of array bracket index dot length, that is the number of columns in row I, or whatever the index value is. So in this example in the code, this a bracket x dot length represents the number of columns in row index x. This takes a little getting used to, but it makes working with two-dimensional arrays in Java rather easy, because you just use something like this to get the number of columns in a particular row. Now, when I run this program, and then I display the elements of the array by calling this display method. And as you can see, I'm using the same types of nested for loops to display the elements. When I run this program, I get this. There's the output for the vals array. What we did in the init method was we set each element of the array to its row index plus its column index. That's why the element at row index 0 and column index 0 equals 0. The index at row index 0 and column index 1 is 1, and so on. And what we've also done with a two-dimensional array is that we've opened up a file. It's right here. I have a file called Women Racers. Here is all the code for that. And what I'm doing is I'm setting a row variable equal to 0, and I say while the file has a line in it, then for each row of the array, in column 0, I'm going to put the name of the racer, and in column 1 of that row, I'm going to put the circuit that the racer raced on. Let me show you what the file looks like. Here is the file. So for each racer, I give a name, first and last, and then I give whatever racing circuit that racer was on, or circuits, plural in some cases. So as you can see, every time I read a name, that's going to go in column 0 of the, or column index 0 of the row. And the circuit that they raced on is going to go into column 1 of the row. And then when I'm done with that, I'm going to use another for loop to just print the data. And when I do that, here's the output for the women racers part of this. Here's what I get. As you can see, here's a name. There's a name. So that is going to be in column 0 of each row. That's where the names are. And the circuits that they raced on, the circuits will be in column 1 of each row. I'm going to pause the video right now, but when I return, I'll show you one more type of two-dimensional array that Java is able to do. Now I'm going to show you a technique in Java known as jagged arrays. This is a case of a two-dimensional array that does not have the same number of columns in each row. Let's look at the example in the PowerPoint slide. Here we're declaring an array which happens to be named jagged. It has 3 rows, but notice we didn't specify the number of columns. Then what we do is we designate the number of columns in each row like this. Here in row index 0, we're going to say that row has 2 columns. We're going to say row index 1 has 3 columns, and row index 2 has 4 columns. And when this array is created, here's what it looks like. Here's row index 0 with its 2 columns. Here's row index 1 with its 3 columns, and row index 2 with its 4 columns. Here in the code, I've declared a jagged array, I call it nums, that has 3 rows. And then I'm going to say row index 0 has 1 column, row index 2 will have 2 columns, and row index 2 has 3 columns. And then I'm going to call the init and display functions like we did before to display what we get. And when I do that, here is my output. The output of that part that I have in red is this. Notice row index 0, column index 0 gives me a 0. And then row index 1, column index 1 gives me a, row index 1, column index 0 gives me a 1. Row index 1, column index 1 gives me a 2. And there's the last line. So there is how a jagged array can be declared in Java. Now, that's one way to declare the rows. The columns. But another way to do it is like this. Suppose you again declare a jagged array that has 3 rows. So we know that if we take name of array dot length, that's going to give us a 3. We want row 0 to have 1 column, row 1 to have 2 columns, and row 2 to have 3 columns. So to pull that off, here's what we're going to do. Nested for loops again. So the outside for loop for the rows goes from 0 to the length of the array. That's the number of rows. Hold on. I'm back. So as I said, the outside loop is the number of rows. That goes from 0 to the length of the array. That's the number of rows. But then inside of this for loop, the first thing I do is I create the columns for that row. So I say stuff bracket I is equal to new int I plus 1. So that means row index I will get I plus 1 columns. So if the index is 0, there is 0 plus 1, 1 column. Index is 1, we get 1 plus 1 or 2 columns. And then from there, I use the inside for loop to put elements into the array. What I've done in the code is I brought back the random number generator. And I have a jagged array that will have 4 rows. And then in here in my for loop, I have my x equals 0 and less than the length of the array. And so the first thing I do in that outside for loop is I make the number of columns for row x. Whatever x is, the row at index x will get x plus 1 columns. And then what I do in my inside for loop, the while loop, notice the loop condition, is I'm giving that a random number between 1 and 50. So all the elements of this jagged array will have values between 1 and 50. And the output looks like this. There you have your jagged array, one column in rows index 0, 2 columns in row index 1, 3 columns in row index 2, and 4 columns in row index 3. Every element of that array contains a random number between 1 and 50. Once again, if you have any questions, please send me an email at kmuldrow@lbcc.edu.